What's up, folks? I'm Dan, and welcome to I've Been Meaning to Read That, the show where I read books out loud that I've been meaning to read. Let's go. I am curious, ladies and gentlemen, to see what books inspired you to become the readers you are to this day. You know how I know you're readers is that right now, when you're not reading, you're listening to an audiobook. That's what readers do, man. Anyways, I'm curious to hear what books really hooked you when you were kids. For me, it was the Redwall series by Brian Jacques. I could not get enough Redwall. If you've never read them, they are a charming series of books set in a fantasy land where all the characters are talking animals, and it's like the Middle Ages. Everything centers around this abbey in the middle of the woods. It's called Redwall. And there's all these mouse warriors and badger lords and fighting hares, and they're always fighting sea rats and corsairs and pirates or something like that. They are equal parts charming and then heavy sometimes. Lots of puzzles and quests and treasure. It's very exciting stuff. Recently, I kind of hit a wall with listening to the classics on Book on Tape, and so I thought, why don't I see if the Redwall audiobooks are still around? And man, are they. They're amazing. I don't want to plug, competitors on this, but I got to give credit where credit's due. The Redwall audiobooks are incredible. They're narrated by the author, Brian Jacques, and they really hold up, even as an adult. There are some books that I read once, at least a decade and a half ago, and I'm listening back to them, and I'm like, I don't remember this. This is awesome. This is exciting. What's going to happen next? And I would love to hear what books you were hooked on. So leave them in the comments below. I bet I'm going to get lots of Harry Potters and Percy Jacksons and Ender's Game and all that stuff. But I'm very excited to read them anyways. All right. Without further ado, let's get to Les Miserables. Chapter 6, Jean Valjean. In the small hours, Jean Valjean awoke. Jean Valjean came from a very poor peasant family in Brie. As a child, he had not learnt to read. When he was old enough, he had gone to work as a tree pruner at Faverolles. His mother's name was Jean Mathieu, and his father was Jean Valjean, or Valjean, the latter being probably a nickname, a contraction of Voilà Jean. The boy was thoughtful without being melancholy, which is a characteristic of warm-hearted natures. In general, he tended to be immature and rather unimpressive, at least in his outward aspect. He had lost both his parents when he was still very young. His mother had died of milk fever, and his father, who was only a pruner, had been killed by a fall from a tree. His only living relative was a widowed sister older than himself who had 7 children, boys and girls. She had housed and fed him while her husband was still alive, but the husband had died when the oldest child was 8 and the youngest only 1. Jean Valjean, who was then just 24, had stepped into the breach and supported the sister who had cared for him. It had happened quite naturally, as a matter of plain duty, but with a certain surliness on the part of Valjean. All his youth had been spent in hard and ill-paid labor. He was never known to have a sweetheart, having had no time to fall in love. He came home tired after work and ate his supper in silence. His sister, Mother Jean, would often take the best bits out of his bowl, the scrap of meat or whatever it might be, to give to one of the children. Seated with his head bowed and the long hair hiding his eyes, he would take no notice of this, but would go on eating as though nothing had happened. Near the cottage where they lived, across the lane, was a farmhouse. The Valjean children, always ravenous, would borrow a jug of milk in their mother's name from the farmer's wife and drink it behind a hedge, snatching the jug from each other so greedily that they spilt milk on their clothes. Had their mother known, she would have whipped them. But Valjean always paid, in his offhand, surly fashion, and they went unpunished. His work as a tree pruner brought him 24 sous a day during the season, and at other times he worked as a harvester, cattleman, or at any other form of casual labor. He did what he could, and his sister also worked, but the 7 children were a great burden. They were a sad little group, engulfed in poverty and always on the verge of destitution. and then came a particularly hard winter. Jean was out of work, and there was no food in the house, literally no bread, and 7 children. One Sunday night, when Maubert Isabeau, the baker on the Place des Anglais in Faverolles, was getting ready for bed, he heard a sound of shattered glass from his barred shop window. He reached the spot in time to see an arm thrust through a hole in the pane. The hand grasped a loaf, and the thief made off at a run. Isabeau chased and caught him. He had thrown away the loaf, but his arm was bleeding. The thief was Jean Valjean. This was in the year 1795. Valjean was tried in the local court for housebreaking and robbery. He possessed a shotgun, which he used for other than legitimate purposes. He was something of a poacher, and this told against him. There is a legitimate prejudice against poachers who, like smugglers, are not far removed from brigandage. Nevertheless, it may be remarked in passing that there is a wide gulf between men of this kind and the murderous criminals in the towns. The poacher works in the woods, and the smuggler in the mountains or on the sea. The towns make men ferocious because they make them corrupt. Mountains, sea, and forest make men reckless. They stir the wildness of men's nature, but do not necessarily destroy what is human. Jean Valjean was found guilty. The penal code was explicit. There are terrible occasions in our civilization, those when the law decrees the wrecking of a human life. It is a fateful moment when society draws back its skirts and consigns a sentient being to irrevocable abandonment. Jean Valjean was sentenced to 5 years' hard labor. On the 22nd of April, 1796, the victory of Montagnau was proclaimed in Paris, a victory won by the general commanding the army in Italy, referred to as Buonaparte in the message addressed by the Directory to the 500, dated the 2nd of Floréal, the year 4. On the same day, a large chain gang was assembled at Bicêtre, of which Jean Valjean was one. A former turnkey at the prison, now aged nearly 90, perfectly recalls the unhappy wretch who was chained at the end of the 4th row in the north corner of the prison yard. He was seated with the rest on the ground and seemed to understand nothing about his situation except that it was hideous. No doubt there was also a vague notion in his ignorant and untutored peasant mind that it was excessive. While heavy hammer blows riveted the iron collar round his neck, he wept so bitterly that he could not speak, except to mumble from time to time, "I was a tree pruner in Faverolles." Still sobbing, he raised his right hand and lowered it in stages, as though he were laying it upon 7 heads of unequal height, a gesture designed to indicate that what he had done had been for the sake of 7 children. He was taken to Toulon, where he arrived, still chained by the neck, after a journey of 27 days in a cart. Here he was clad in the red smock, and everything that had been his life was blotted out, even to his name. He was no longer Jean Valjean, but number 24601. As to what became of his sister and children, who knew or cared? What becomes of the leaves of a tree sawed down at the root? It's an old story. Those unhappy beings, God's creatures, left without support, guidance, or shelter. They were scattered, no one knows where. Each presumably went its own way, to become lost in that cold murk that envelops solitary destinies, the distressful shadows wherein disappear so many unfortunates in the somber progress of mankind. They left the district. The church tower of what had been their village, the hedgerows of what had been their countryside, forgot them. After a few years' imprisonment, even Jean Valjean forgot them. What had been an open wound was covered by a scar. That is all. During all the time he was in Toulon, he only had news of his sister. It was, I think, towards the end of his 4th year. I do not know how the news reached him. Someone who had been known to them in Faverolles had seen her. She was living in Paris, in a poor street near Saint-Sepulchre, with only one of her children, the youngest, a little boy. Where were the other 6? Perhaps she herself did not know. She was working as a folder and stitcher for a printer in the Rue de Sabot. She had to be there at 6 in the morning, well before daybreak in winter. There was a school in the same house where she took her 7-year-old boy. But since she started work at 6 and the school did not open until 7, the child had to wait for an hour in the open air of the courtyard, in winter, and in the hour of darkness. He was not allowed into the printer's shop because, they said, he got in the way. Passing workmen would see the poor little creature crouched half asleep on the cobbles or huddled sleeping over his basket. On rainy days, an old woman, the concierge, would take pity on him and let him into her den, which contained nothing but a truckle bed, a spinning wheel, and 2 wooden chairs. Here, the little boy would curl up in a corner, hugging the cat for warmth. At 7 o'clock, he went into school. This was what Jean Valjean learned, and the story brought a momentary blaze of light, as though a window had been suddenly opened on the lives of those beings he had loved. Then it was closed again. He heard no more of them. He was destined never to see them again, and there will be no further mention of them in this tale. Jean Valjean's turn to escape came towards the end of that 4th year. His fellow prisoners helped him, as was customary. He got away, and for 2 days drifted in freedom through the countryside. If to be tracked is freedom, to be constantly on the alert, to tremble at every sound, to be frightened of everything, a smoking chimney, a passing man, a barking dog, a galloping horse, a striking clock, to be frightened of the daylight because one can see, and of the darkness because one cannot, to be frightened of the road, the pathway, and the thicket, to be afraid to sleep. On the evening of the 2nd day, he was caught. He had neither eaten nor slept for 36 hours. The tribunal added 3 years to his sentence, making 8 in all. His second turn came in the 6th year, and again he used it, but with even less success. His absence was discovered at roll call. The alarm gun was fired, and that night the watch found him in the dockyard, hiding under the keel of a vessel under construction. He fought against them, and for the crimes of attempted escape and resisting arrest, the code prescribed the penalty of an additional 5 years, 2 in double chains. 13 years. His third turn came in the 10th year, and again he tried and failed. For this he got another 3 years, making 16. It was in the 13th year, I believe, that he made his last attempt. He was out for only 4 hours, but they cost him another 3 years. 19 years altogether. He was released in October of 1815, after being imprisoned in 1796 for having broken a window pane and stolen a loaf of bread. A brief parenthesis. This is the second time that the present writer, in his study of the penal system and the damning of men's souls by law, has found the theft of a loaf of bread to be the starting point of the wrecking of a life. Claude Joux stole a loaf, as did Jean Valjean. English statistics have established that in London, hunger is the direct cause of 4 robberies out of 5. Jean Valjean had gone to imprisonment weeping and trembling. He emerged impassive. He had gone despairing. He emerged grim-faced. What had taken place in this man's soul? End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Inwardness of Despair. We must try to answer the question. It is very necessary that society should look at these matters, since they are the work of society. He was an untutored man, as we have said, but that is not to say that he was stupid. There was a spark of natural intelligence in him, and adversity, which sheds its own light, had fostered the light slowly dawning in his mind. Under the lash and in chains, in fatigue and in the solitary cell, under the burning Mediterranean sun and on the prisoner's plank bed, he withdrew into his own conscience and reflected. Constituting himself judge and jury, he began by trying his own case. He admitted that he was not an innocent man unjustly punished. He had committed an excessive and blameworthy act. The loaf of bread might not have been refused him if he had asked for it, and in any event it would have been better to wait, either for charity or for work. The argument, "Can a man wait when he is half-starved?" was not unanswerable, for the fact is that very few people literally die of hunger. Man is so constituted that he can endure long periods of suffering, both moral and physical, without dying of it. He should have had patience, and this would have been better even for the children. To attempt to take society by the throat, vulnerable creature that he was, and to suppose that he could escape from poverty through theft, had been an act of folly. In any case, the road leading to infamy was a bad road of escape. He had admitted all this. In short, that he had done wrong. But then he asked questions. Was he the only one at fault in this fateful business? Was it not a serious matter that a man willing to work should have been without work and without food? And, admitting the offense, had not the punishment been ferocious and outrageous? Was not the law more at fault in the penalty it inflicted than he had been in the crime he committed? Had not the scales of justice been overweighted on the side of expiation? And did not this weighting of the scales, far from effacing the crime, produce a quite different result, namely, a reversal of the situation, substituting for the original crime the crime of oppression, making the criminal a victim and the law his debtor, transferring justice to the side of him who had offended against it? Did not the penalty, aggravated by his attempts to escape, become in the end a sort of assault by the stronger on the weaker, a crime committed by society against the individual and repeated daily for 19 years? He asked himself whether human society had the right to impose upon its members, on the one hand, its mindless improvidence, and, on the other, its merciless providence, to grind a poor man between the millstones of need and excess, need of work and excess of punishment. Was it not monstrous that society should treat in this fashion precisely those least favored in the distribution of wealth, which is a matter of chance, and therefore those most needing indulgence? He asked these questions and, having answered them, passed judgment on society. He condemned it to his hatred. He held it responsible for what he was undergoing and resolved that, if the chance occurred, he would not hesitate to call it to account. He concluded that there was no true balance between the wrong he had done and the wrong that was inflicted upon him, and that although his punishment might not be technically an injustice, it was beyond question an iniquity. Anger may be ill-considered and absurd. We may be mistakenly angered, but only when there is some deep-seated reason are we outraged. Jean Valjean was outraged. Moreover, society as a whole had done him nothing but injury. He had seen nothing of it but the sour face which it calls justice and shows only to those it castigates. Men had touched him only to hurt him. His only contact with him had been through blows. From the time of his childhood, and except for his mother and sister, he had never encountered a friendly word or a kindly look. During the years of suffering, he reached the conclusion that life was a war in which he was one of the defeated. Hatred was his only weapon, and he resolved to sharpen it in prison and carry it with him when he left. There was in Toulon a school conducted by monks which offered elementary instruction to those unfortunates who were willing to accept it. Valjean was among them. He went there when he was 40 and learned to read, write, and calculate, with the feeling that to improve his mind was to fortify his hatred. There are circumstances in which education and enlightenment can become an extension of evil. The sad fact must be recorded that, having condemned society as the cause of his misfortune, he took it upon himself to pass judgment on the providence which had created society, and this, too, he condemned. Thus, during those 19 years of torture and enslavement, his spirit both grew and shrank. Light entered on one side, and darkness on the other. As we have seen, he was not bad by nature. He had been still virtuous when he was sent to prison. There, he learned to condemn society, and felt himself becoming evil. He condemned providence, and knew that he became impious. It is difficult at this point not to pause for a moment to reflect. Can human nature be ever wholly and radically transformed? Can the man whom God made good be made wicked by man? Can the soul be reshaped in its entirety by destiny and made evil because destiny is evil? Can the heart become misshapen and afflicted with ugly, incurable deformities under disproportionate misfortune, like a spinal column bent beneath a too low roof? Is there not in every human soul, and was there not in the soul of Jean Valjean, an essential spark, an element of the divine, indestructible in this world and immortal in the next, which goodness can preserve, nourish, and fan into glorious flame, and which evil can never quite extinguish? These are weighty and obscure questions, to the last of which any psychologist would probably have answered no, had he seen Jean Valjean in Toulon during a rest period, seated with arms crossed over a capstan bar, the end of his chain thrust into his pocket to stop it dragging, a brooding galley slave, somber, silent, and vengeful, an outcast of the laws glaring in anger at men, one of the damned of civilization looking accusingly at heaven. There can be little doubt, and we may not pretend otherwise, that the observant psychologist would have seen in him a case of incurable abasement, a sick man for whom he might feel pity, but for whom he could propose no remedy. He would have averted his gaze from the spiritual abysses he discerned, and, like Dante at the gate of hell, have expunged from that life the word which God's finger writes on the brow of every man, the word hope. And what of Valjean himself? Was the spiritual state which we have depicted as plain to him as we have sought to make it to the reader? Had he any clear perception, after they were formed, or during their formation, of the elements of which his moral degradation was composed? Could a man so crude and untaught take any positive account of the process whereby, by gradual stages, his spirit had risen and sunk into those depths which through the years had come to constitute his moral horizon? We cannot venture to say so, and in fact we do not believe it. He was too ignorant to be lucid in his thoughts, even after so much hardship. There were times when he could not be sure of his own feelings. He lived in shadow, suffered in shadow, hated the shadows, and may be said to have hated himself. He lived in darkness, fumbling like a blind man, a man in a dream. Only occasionally was he overtaken by a burst of furious rage, rising within him or provoked from without. There was an overflow of suffering, a swift, searing flame illuminating all his soul and shedding its ugly light on everything that lay behind him and ahead, the chasms and somber vistas of his destiny. But these flashes passed. The darkness closed in again. And where was he? He did not know. It is characteristic of this form of punishment, inspired by all that is pitiless, that is to say brutalizing, that gradually, by a process of mindless erosion, it turns a man into an animal, sometimes a ferocious one. Jean Valjean's repeated and obstinate efforts to escape are evidence of the effect of this legal chastisement on the human spirit. He would have made further hopeless attempts whenever the chance offered, without giving a thought to the consequences or to past experience. Like a caged wolf, he dashed madly for the door whenever he found it open. Instinct prompted him to run where reason would have bidden him stay. In the face of that overwhelming impulse, reason vanished. It was the animal that acted, and the added penalties inflicted on him when he was recaptured served only to increase its savagery. A detail which we must not fail to mention is that in physical strength, Jean Valjean far surpassed any other inmate of the prison. On fatigue duties, or hauling an anchor chain, or turning a capstan, he was worth 4 men. He could lift and carry enormous weights, and on occasion did duty for the appliance known as a jack, in those days called an oriole, from which the Rue Montorgueil, near the Paris Halles, derives its name. Once, when the balcony of the Toulon town hall was being repaired, one of the admirable caryatides by Puget which support it came loose and was in danger of falling. Valjean, who was on the spot, propped it up with his shoulder until help arrived. His dexterity was even greater than his strength. There are prisoners obsessed with the thought of escape, eternally envious of the birds and the flies, who make a positive cult of the physical sciences, daily performing a mysterious ritual of exercises. The climbing of a sheer surface, where scarcely any hand or foothold was to be discerned, was to Valjean a pastime. Given the angle of a wall and applying the thrust of his back and legs, with elbows and heels gripping the rough surface of the stone, he could climb 3 stories as though by magic. He had even reached the prison roof. He spoke seldom and never smiled. It took some extreme emotion to wring from him, perhaps once or twice in a year, the sour convict chuckle that is like the laughter of demons. The sight of him suggested that he was continually absorbed in the contemplation of something terrible. And so he was. With the hazy perception of an unformed nature and an overborne intelligence, he was confusedly aware of something monstrous that oppressed him. When he sought to look upward beyond the pallid half-light in which he crouched, it was to see, with mingled terror and rage, an endless structure rising above him, a dreadful piling up of things, laws, prejudices, men, and facts, whose shape he could not discern, and whose mass appalled him, and which was nothing else than the huge pyramid that we call civilization. Here and there in the formless, swarming heap, near to him, or at an inaccessible height, some detail would be thrown into sharp relief: the prison warder with his truncheon, the gendarme with his saber. Above these, the mitred bishop, and at the very top, like a sun, the emperor radiantly crowned. Far from dispelling his own darkness, those distant splendors seemed only to intensify it. Life came and went above his head. Laws, prejudices, facts, men, and things, in the intricate and mysterious pattern God stamps on civilization, bearing down and crushing him with a placid cruelty and remorseless indifference. Men fallen into the nethermost pit of adversity, lost in that limbo where the eyes do not follow, those outcasts of the law feel upon their necks the whole weight of society, so formidable to the outsider, so terrifying to the underdog. It was in this situation that Jean Valjean pondered, and what could his thoughts be? What could they be but the thoughts of a grain of corn ground between millstones, if it were capable of thinking? All these things, reality charged with fantasy, and fantasy laden with reality, ended by creating in him a frame of mind scarcely to be expressed in words. At times he would pause in his prison labors to stand reflective, and his reason, at once more mature and more disturbed, would recoil in disbelief. The things that happened to him seemed inconceivable, the world around him grotesque. He would say to himself, "This is a dream," and stare at the warder standing a few feet away as though he were seeing a ghost, until suddenly the ghost dealt him a blow. He was almost unconscious of the natural world. It would be nearly true to say of Jean Valjean that, for him, the sun did not exist, or any summer day, or clear skies, or April dawns. Heaven alone knows what sullied light filtered through to his soul. To sum up this account of him, so far as it can be done in concrete terms, we may say that in 19 years Jean Valjean, the harmless tree pruner of Faverolles and the sinister galley slave of Toulon, thanks to the way imprisonment had shaped him, had become capable of two kinds of ill deed. First, the heedless, unpremeditated act executed in a blind fury, as some sort of a reprisal for the wrongs he had suffered. And secondly, the deliberate and considered crime, justified in his mind by the thoughts inspired by those wrongs. His calculated thinking passed through 3 successive stages of reason, resolve, and obstinacy, which are only possible to natures of a certain kind. His impulses were governed by resentment, bitterness, and a profound sense of injury, which might vent itself even upon good and innocent people, if any such came his way. The beginning and the end of all his thought was hatred of human laws, a hatred which, if some providential happening does not arrest its growth, may swell in time into a hatred of all society, all mankind, all created things, becoming a savage and obsessive desire to inflict harm on no matter what or whom. It will be seen that the yellow ticket he carried had some warrant for describing Jean Valjean as a very dangerous man. Year by year, slowly but inexorably, his spirit had withered. Dry of heart and dry-eyed, during his 19 years' imprisonment, he had not shed a tear. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Sea and Shadow. "Man overboard!" But the ship does not stop. The wind is blowing, and the doom-laden vessel is set on a course from which it cannot depart. It sails on. The man sinks and reappears, flings up his arms and shouts, but no one hears. The ship, heeling in the wind, is intent upon its business, and passengers and crew have lost sight of him, a pinpoint in the immensity of the sea. He calls despairingly, gazing in anguish after the receding sail as, ghost-like, it fades from view. A short time ago he was on board, a member of the crew busy on deck with the rest, a living being with his share of air and sunlight. What has become of him now? He slipped and fell, and this is the end. He is adrift in the monstrous waters with only their turbulence beneath him. hideously enclosed by wave crests, shredded by the wind, smothered as they break over his head, tumbled from one to another, rising and sinking into unfathomable darkness where he seems to become a part of the abyss, his mouth filled with bitter resentment at this treacherous ocean that is so resolved to destroy him, this monster toying with his death. To him, the sea has become the embodiment of hatred. But he goes on swimming, still struggles despairingly for life, his strength dwindling as he battles against the inexhaustible. Above him, he can see only the bleak pallor of the clouds. He is the witness in his death throes of the immeasurable dementia of the sea, and, tormented by this madness, he hears sounds unknown to man that seem to come from some dreadful place beyond the bounds of earth. There are birds flying amid the clouds as angels soar over the distresses of mankind, but what can they do for him? They sing as they glide and hover, while he gasps for life. He is lost between the infinities of sea and sky, the one a tomb, the other a shroud. Darkness is falling. He has swum for hours until his strength is at an end, and the ship with its company of men has long since passed from sight. Solitary in the huge gulf of twilight, he twists and turns, feeling the waves of the unknowable close in upon him. And for the last time he calls, but not to man. Where is God? He calls to anyone or anything. He calls and calls, but there is no reply. Nothing on the face of the waters, nothing in the heavens. He calls to the sea and spray, but they're deaf. He calls to the winds, but they are answerable only to infinity. Around him, dusk and solitude, the heedless tumult of wild waters. Within him, terror and exhaustion. Below him, the descent into nothingness. No foothold. He pictures his body adrift in that limitless dark. The chill numbs him. His hands open and close, clutching at nothing. Wind and tumult and useless stars. What can he do? Despair ends in resignation. Exhaustion chooses death. And so at length he gives up the struggle, and his body sinks forever. Such is the remorseless progression of human society, shedding lives and souls as it goes on its way. It is an ocean into which men sink who have been cast out by the law and consigned, with help most cruelly withheld, to moral death. The sea is the pitiless social darkness into which the penal system casts those it has condemned, an unfathomable waste of misery. The human soul, lost in those depths, may become a corpse. Who shall revive it? End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Fresh Tribulations. When at the time of his leaving prison, Jean Valjean heard the words, "You are free," the moment had seemed blinding and unbelievable, as though he were suddenly pierced by a shaft of light, the true light of living men. But this gleam swiftly faded. He had been dazzled by the idea of liberty. He had believed for an instant in a new life. He soon discovered the meaning of liberty when it is accompanied by a yellow ticket. And with this came further disillusion. He had calculated that his savings during his imprisonment would amount to 171 francs. It must be said in fairness that he had omitted to allow for Sundays and feast days, days of enforced rest, which reduced this total by about 24 francs. But there had been other deductions conforming to prison regulations, and the sum he received was 109 francs and 15 sous. He did not understand the reason for this, and thought himself cheated, in plain language, robbed. In Grasse, on the day after his release, he saw some men unloading bales of orange blossom outside a scent distillery. He volunteered his labor, and since the matter was urgent, he was taken on. He was intelligent, strong, and adroit. He worked well, and the foreman seemed content. While he was at work, a passing gendarme noticed him and asked to see his papers. He had to show the yellow ticket, after which he went back to work. Earlier, he had asked one of the other men the rate of pay for the day and had been told that it was 30 sous. In the evening, since he was obliged to move on next morning, he went to the foreman and asked for his wage. Without saying anything, the man handed him 25 sous and said, when he protested, "That's good enough for you." He again protested, and the foreman looked hard at him and said, "Watch it, or you'll be back inside." Again he felt that he had been robbed. Society had robbed him wholesale of a part of his savings. Now it was the turn of the individual to rob him in detail. Release, he discovered, was not deliverance. A man may leave prison, but he is still condemned. This was what happened to him in Grasse. We know of his reception in D. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. The Man Awakens. Jean Valjean awoke as the cathedral clock was striking 2. What had awakened him was an over-comfortable bed. He had not slept in a bed for 20 years, and although he had not taken off his clothes, the sensation was too unfamiliar not to disturb his sleep. Nevertheless, he had slept for over 4 hours and recovered from his exhaustion. He was not accustomed to long hours of rest. He opened his eyes and peered into the darkness, then closed them, hoping to fall asleep again. But after a day of various emotions, when many thoughts have oppressed the mind, we may fall once asleep, but not a second time. Sleep comes more readily than it returns. This was the case with Valjean. He could not get to sleep again and lay thinking. He was in a state of great mental perturbation, assailed with a flood of old and new impressions, which changed incessantly in shape, grew immeasurably, and suddenly vanished as though in a turgid stream. Many thoughts occurred to him, but there was one in particular that constantly returned, overshadowing the rest. It was the thought of the silver on the bishop's table. Those silver knives and forks obsessed him. There they were, only a few yards away. He had seen Madame Magloire put them in the cupboard when he passed through the bishop's room, and he had noted the position of the cupboard, on the right as one entered from the dining room. They were solid pieces of old silver, and with the big ladle would fetch at least 200 francs, twice what he had earned in 19 years, although it was true that he would have got more if the authorities had not robbed him. For a whole hour he remained in a state of indecision in which there was an element of conflict. The clock struck 3. He opened his eyes again and sat up briskly, reaching out an arm to grope for the knapsack that he had let fall by the bedside. Then he swung his legs over, and almost without knowing it, found himself seated on the bed with his feet on the floor. He remained for some time in this posture, a sinister figure to anyone seeing him thus seated in the darkness, the only wakeful person in that sleeping house. Suddenly he bent down, removed his shoes, and laid them very quietly on the bedside mat. Then he returned to his state of pensive immobility. The ugly thoughts jostled in his brain, came and went, bearing down on him like a physical weight, and at the same time, unaccountably, with the obstinate irrelevance of distracted mediation, he was thinking of something entirely different. One of his fellow prisoners had been a man named Brevet, who kept his trousers up with a single brace of knitted cotton. The check design of that brace repeatedly occurred to him. He might have stayed like this until daybreak if the clock had not sounded again, striking the quarter or half hour. It roused him as though it had been a signal. He got to his feet and stood listening. The house was quite silent. He then moved cautiously towards the window, of which the outline was clearly discernible. The night was not very dark. There was a full moon intermittently hidden by large clouds scudding in the wind, creating, out of doors, an alternation of darkness and light, and indoors a sort of twilight, sufficient to move by, rising and dimming like the light from a basement window when people are passing outside. Having reached the window, Valjean examined it. It was not barred. It opened onto the garden and, after the local custom, was fastened only with a small latch. Cold air flooded the room when he opened it, and he quickly closed it again. The door still made no sound, and now it was wide enough open for him to pass through. But close by was a small table set at an awkward angle, which still blocked his passage. There was nothing for it but to open the door wider still. Summoning his resolution, he gave it a third and more vigorous push, and this time one of the hinges emitted a long and piercing squeak. Jean Valjean shivered. The sound was as appalling to him as that of the last trumpet. In those first wild moments of dismay, he could almost believe that the hinge had become endowed with supernatural life and was barking like a watchdog to warn the sleepers in the house. He sank quivering back on his heels, hearing the blood thunder in his temples, while the noise of his breath was like wind roaring out of a cave. It seemed to him impossible that the dreadful din would not arouse the household as effectively as an earthquake. The door had given the alarm. The old man would start up. The old woman would scream. Help would come running. Within a quarter of an hour, the town would be in an uproar, and the gendarme would be active. During those moments, he thought he was lost. He stayed where he was, stock still and not daring to move. Several minutes passed. The door was now wide open. He ventured to peer into the room. Nothing stirred. He listened and heard no sound of movement in the house. It seemed that the rusty hinge had not awakened anyone. That peril was over, but although he was still in a state of great perturbation, he did not turn back. He had not turned back even when he thought he was done for. His only thought was to get the business over quickly. He moved on into the bedroom. It was perfectly quiet. Vague shapes were discernible, which by daylight would have been seen to be papers scattered over a table, open folios, books piled on a stool, garments draped over a chair, a prie-dieu, now only visible as contrasts of light and shadow. Valjean moved cautiously forward, hearing from the far side of the room the quiet, steady breathing of the bishop. He came to an abrupt stop at the bedside, finding that he had reached it sooner than he expected. Nature, at times, adds her own commentary to our actions with a kind of somber and considered eloquence, as though she were bidding us reflect. For nearly half an hour, the sky had been darkened by clouds. At the moment when Jean Valjean stopped by the bed, the clouds were torn asunder as though by a deliberate act, and moonlight, flooding through the tall window, fell upon the bishop's face. He was sleeping peacefully. Because of the coldness of night in the lower Alps, he wore a bed jacket of brown wool which covered his arms to the wrists. His head lay back on the pillow in the abandonment of repose, and the hand wearing the episcopal ring, a hand responsible for so much that was good and well done, hung down outside the sheets. His face wore a look of serenity, hope, and beatitude, something more than a smile and little short of radiance, the reflection of light that was not to be seen. The spirits of the righteous in sleep commune with the mysterious heaven. It was the light of this heaven that lay upon the bishop, a luminosity emanating from himself, the light of his own conscience. At the moment when the moon shone upon him, mingling with his inner light, he seemed, in the soft half-dark, to wear a halo. The brightness of the moon, the stillness of the garden, the quietness of the house, the deep repose of the hour, all this conferred a tranquil majesty upon the venerable white head now sunk in childlike sleep, an unconscious nobility approaching the divine. Motionless in the shadow, gripping the spike in his hand, Jean Valjean stood gazing in a kind of terror at the old man. He had never before seen anything like this. On the moral plane, there can be no more moving contrast than that between an uneasy conscience bent upon a misdeed and the unguarded slumber of innocence. In that solitary confrontation, there was an element of the sublime, of which Valjean was obscurely but strongly aware. No one, not even himself, could have described his feeling. We have to imagine utmost violence in the presence of utmost gentleness. Nothing could have been discerned with certainty from his expression, which was one of haggard astonishment. He stood looking down, and no one could have read his thoughts. That he was profoundly moved was evident, but what was the nature of his emotion? He looked away from the bed. All that clearly emerged from his attitude and expression was that he was in a state of strange indecision, seemingly adrift between the two extremes of death on the one hand and salvation on the other, ready to shatter that skull or to kiss that hand. After some moments, he slowly raised his left arm and removed his cap. Then, letting his arm sink as slowly as he had raised it, he resumed his attitude of contemplation, holding the cap in his left hand and the weapon in his right, the hair unruly on his wild head, while the bishop continued to sleep peacefully beneath his terrifying gaze. Above the mantelpiece, the crucifix was dimly visible with its arms extended as though to both men, in benediction of the one and forgiveness of the other. Valjean suddenly put his cap back on his head, and without looking at the bishop, moved quickly to the cupboard. He raised the spike, preparing to force the lock, but the key was in it. The first thing he saw when he opened the door was the basket of silver. He grabbed it, crossed the room with long strides regardless of precaution, re-entered the oratory, picked up his stick, opened the window, climbed over the sill, emptied the silver into his knapsack, threw away the basket, crossed the garden, and, scrambling like a great cat over the wall, took to his heels. End of chapter 11.
And cut. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks for listening to today's episode of I've Been Meaning to Read That with me, your host, Dan. If you want to learn more about the show, you can follow us on Instagram at Meaning to Read and TikTok at I've Been Meaning. If you want to support the show to help keep it going, you can find me on Venmo at Dingus Donut, DINGUSDONUT. Supporters get a shout out on the show, and even more important, get to vote on the next book that we read. No matter what, I'll see you for our next episode. Until then, read those books you've been meaning to read, and have a lovely, lovely day.